Very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us live and also who is watching the recording later of the Explorations in Carceral Geography seminar series today. Before we start today's event, I just wanted to take the opportunity to briefly introduce the seminar series and the working group. So the Carceral Geography Working Group of the Royal Geographical Society with the Institute of British Geographers, the RGS-IBG, brings together geographers and others interested in spaces, practices, and experiences of confinement and incarceration. And you can join our group. It's a nice group of people. Membership is free and open to all, no matter where you are. You don't have to be in the UK at all. And it's just a nice way of joining researchers across different countries. So do consider it. The Explorations in Carceral Geography seminar series aims to provide time and space to engage in a more in-depth way with scholarship on carceral topics or of topics of interest to carceral geographers and other researchers of prisons and institutions like that. So we hold seminars 2 to 3 times a year as an online event that enables us to be open to all beyond kind of borders. And this seminar series goes beyond the usual engagement with scholarly work and delves into pieces of writing. So we usually kind of give access to pieces of writing or other materials beforehand. And it's an open format, so we try and interview the authors and they give a short presentation, and there's time at the end to have a further discussion. And we want to foster debate and thinking through and beyond carceral spaces, and to rethink what it means, where we locate them, and what it entails for the future. We hope that this online seminar series promotes a global conversation, and an active involvement of attendees and debates is most welcome. So everyone who's attending today, please feel free to ask lots of questions and just engage with the authors and also just the panel in general. And as a matter of fact, today's seminar, as you probably know, is part of the 5th Carceral Geography Conference, which was held in Melbourne in Australia this year. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank the organizing team of the conference in Melbourne, as well as Jen Turner, who organized all the online satellite events that have taken place over the last couple of days. The people who would have joined us from Melbourne will probably be in the pub right now, because over there, at this being the last online event, the conference is already finished in Australia. But I hope that some of you will be able to join us for the recording later down the line, and hope you enjoy your drinks as well. Okay, so for today's seminar, I'm really excited to hear about and discuss open prisons with our wonderful presenters. But before we can do that, I just wanted to mention a few housekeeping items, okay, and get them out of the way. So I would ask everyone who's not speaking at the time to mute themselves, and we will invite you to speak, and then you can unmute yourself for the discussion. Cameras can remain on or off, depending how you prefer it, but it would be nice for the Q&A at the end if you could turn your camera on, if that's at all possible. And please feel free to type questions in advance if you want, and press send. You can also ask questions about the papers that we uploaded online for you in advance. And today's timeline for the seminar includes the 2 initial presentations that are roughly 15 minutes long, and followed by a kind of panel discussion before we open the floor to all participants to join the discussion at the end. And this seminar will officially finish at 2 p.m. Central European time at the very latest. So just so you have a kind of rough outline of what's going to happen today. And just to make clear to everyone in the room again, this session is being recorded. So if you don't want to be part of the recording, you have to kind of make that clear to the organizers so they can cut you out of the video before it's being uploaded. Okay. 1 second. So just to start off today's exploration seminar properly now, I'm delighted to introduce today's theme of open carcerality and the geographies of open prisons, as well as our two speakers, Pakes and Kristian Mjåland. And well, I just wanted to give you a very short overview of the topic before I hand over to our two presenters. So most research on penal institutions in geography, as well as in criminology and prison sociology, looks at closed prisons or related closed institutions. Open prisons have not only been under-researched, but also pose a considerable conceptual challenge. The idea of open prisons arose as part of a reformist movement and took hold across different jurisdictions at different times. Also I guess, looked at penal policies in different ways, so they incorporated in the idea of open prisons maybe slightly differently. Today, open prisons only form a small part of the prison estate in most countries, but they're interesting to study due to their potential to inflict less harm, to provide more positive long-term outcomes due to how they sit on the edge of carcerality and how they are just affecting prisoners and maybe also staff and family members and so on in a different way. And in this exploration session, we want to interrogate the conceptual and practical implications while considering both more punitive and rehabilitative regimes in carceral environments. So what we want to explore is if open prisons are somewhat a contradiction in terms, but also want to debate what constitutes an open prison in the first place. Is an open prison a building that is open in an open space with no physical boundaries, for example, or are there other forms of closure at play that we want to discuss that we can maybe not see as easily as the architectural features? Is it an institution that sets itself apart from closed forms of detention, or does it only work in combination with more closed parts of the estate? We want to discuss these questions and more, but first want to hear from our two excellent speakers who have both done research in open prisons in several countries. And I just wanted to briefly introduce them. Kristian Mjåland is an associate professor in sociology at the University of Agder in Norway, and his research interests are mainly concerned with punishment, prisons, drugs, and coercive treatment. And he's primarily a qualitative researcher with considerable experience in ethnographic fieldwork and qualitative interviewing. And he particularly looks at comparative penology and explores issues such as penal power, resistance, punishment, legitimacy, and procedural justice. Pakes is a professor of criminology at the University of Portsmouth in the UK, and he's particularly interested in comparative criminal justice as well, in prisons in particular. And he's written quite extensively on prisons and also open prisons in several different countries, for example, in Iceland and the Netherlands, and has provided access to his papers on open prisons in Iceland for the seminar as well. So Francis, you're going to start with your presentation, and thanks so much to both of you for joining us today. Right, I'm just going to close this down so you can start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for your kind words. I want to say thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to sit in my house in the south of England, talking to people from all over the world, either live or via the recording. That's marvelous. Great to be paired up with Kristian Mjåland, whose work I really appreciate and admire. So it's a fantastic pairing as far as I'm concerned. So absolutely delighted to be part of this. And yes, I want to talk to you particularly about Iceland. And while I get myself organized with the scary bit, which is getting the sharing of the screen happening, starting the slideshow. Can someone give me a little shout to say that they see a title slide?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So yes, I'd like to virtually take you to Iceland, which is far from here and particularly far from Australia, I suppose. And it's because the open prisons in Iceland are really unknown, I think, in criminology more widely, in penology, and probably also in carceral geography. And they do really speak to the sort of the thematics that you just raised, Anna, about what is openness, and to what extent is openness a physical feature, to what extent is openness something symbolic or interactional. And by explaining to you the details of these places, that might just give us a start discussing these things sensibly, because there is something about the periphery that is very, very interesting to consider. Now, when people think about Iceland, it is stuff like this that particularly comes to mind. People think about the waterfalls, the mountains. This is Kirkjufell mountain, which is relatively famous on the tourist trail because it has been in the backdrop of a Game of Thrones episode and has therefore acquired something of a cult status. And what tourists don't realize is that when you arrive here at the waterfall and the mountain, that only a mile from here, one turn on the road, there is a very small open prison that to me, as a penologist, as a comparative criminologist, is actually far more intriguing than all of the nature, which is, I'm sure you believe me, absolutely stunning. So this is just my recreation of that photograph on my latest visit to this prison. So what I'd like to do is quickly set a stage on Iceland, a small country, and that has consequences, I think, for criminal justice policy. The population is in the order of 350,000, which in many countries is the size of a town or city rather than a country. And the prison population is less than 200 overall, dispersed over 4 prisons. And that is also highly consequential in how the penal estate, on the one hand, but also how interpersonal relations are formed and maintained, because the numbers are so small. So I tend to say that in the UK, where there's 80,000 prisoners, that is a city or a town. In Norway, with a few thousand prisoners, you could conceive of their population as populating a village, a sizable village. Whereas in Iceland, people could in fact live on the street. It is that sort of scale, and scale does matter, I believe, in thinking about these things. But also historically, not much of a preoccupation with crime or imprisonment, not much in the way of penal populism, so that you don't tend to see some of the solutions in quotation marks that have been developed, particularly in Anglophone countries. And because of that, the penal estate looks different and certainly also feels different. So very quickly, a tour of the 4 prisons that Iceland at the moment has. This is the biggest and the oldest, Litlahren, Little Lava on the south coast, houses up to 70 prisoners, and in all honesty, it is an eyesore. It is dilapidated. It really needs an overhaul. That is now planned. The Icelandic government is intending to spend good money on this prison to bring it up to scratch. It's had issues with spice, the drug that wreaks havoc in many prisons across the world, and it is in no way reminiscent of what we call Nordic penal exceptionalism. The idea that in the Nordic countries, prisons are easy on the eye, well equipped, well built, with excellent staff prisoner relationships. That really isn't particularly the case in this prison. Then this is the newest prison. So we went from the oldest to the newest. This is also a closed prison. This is an all-purpose prison in the small country of Iceland, where there isn't a separate women's prison anymore. There used to be one, but that's closed. So all women in the closed estate are housed here in one wing. There is one wing for remand, and there are also sentenced prisoners being held here. Up to about 60 is the capacity of this place. And prisoners don't talk about this prison in highly appreciative terms. It's tidy, it's neat, it's clean, but it's also cold. And one of the ways in which to understand that coldness is, if you look in the middle, there is this circle, this cylinder. which represents the areas where the prison officers tend to be. It is a nerve center. It's where the CCTV is, but also the comfy chairs for prison officers. And if a prisoner in a cell needs or wants to speak to an officer, then they need to push a button in their cell. And then they speak to the prison officer via an intercom. This is a small prison. The officer will be only yards away. And in the Icelandic way of doing things, this is against the grain. This feels like an oddly distant and cold way of engaging with each other. So the atmosphere that this tends to create, it is one that has an atypical coldness and distance in its approach. But as you can see, money has been spent on this thing. It's been in operation for about 5 years now. And it's quite near the capital city of Reykjavik. But where I want to go, people, is the open prisons, and there are two. So this is the first. It's called Sogn. It's not too far from the prison you just saw. And in terms of build, it is a former sanatorium. So it's not purpose-built as a prison. When there was tuberculosis in Iceland, places like this is where patients would be cared for. And many have been either taken down or repurposed. So this is now an open prison. And you can see the sports field, the hills in the back. And if you were to take, if you were to turn around for 180 degrees, you'd see the sea a number of miles away. It's quite a panoramic view. So this is, yeah, what you would say out in the sticks. It's for Icelandic purposes in a relatively densely populated area, but for most individual standards, it's very, very rural and very, very quiet. And then finally, this one. You'll see the same mountain in the background that we discussed just before. This is called Kvíabrygge, and Kvíabrygge is essentially a farm. It used to be a farm building that in the 1950s got appropriated by the state and has been developed into an open prison. So the farm building that you would see on the right is where all the prisoners are housed. The smattering of buildings just to the left are workshops, etc., to keep a farm estate going. There's livestock on the farm, fishing, that sort of activities sort of dominate the everyday running of this particular prison. It houses about 20 prisoners at any one time, and that's the same sort of number as the previous prison did. So these are very small places where on any normal day you have maybe 20 prisoners, you have maybe 2 or 3 members of staff, maybe someone to support the education or work, but that's about it. Very small world. And this one is quite remote. This is much further away from the capital city area. So this place, I would say, is characterized by a double remoteness. Iceland, for most intents and purposes, is quite far. And then this prison is again quite far from pretty much all urban areas in Iceland, and there aren't many in the first place. So when you talk about carceral edges, the penal periphery, then this place really finds itself on the periphery of land. The water is right next door. It is in a remote country and in a remote place in that remote country. And this is a more prosaic photograph of the same place that I took during one of my visits. And I remember very clearly visiting this place for the first time. A number of years ago now, and many of the things that struck me and stayed with me are the very things that are the topic of our conversation today. It is about openness. So one of the things that struck me about openness in some sense is the relative ease with which these visits were organized. The other is that there is a complete lack of any sort of perimeter security. So that when you drive up, all you need to do to get to the building is drive over a cattle grid to keep the sheep in. And there's one just rope that you need to just remove for the moment, drive through and put back up. And that's all the security that's there to deter or prevent people from coming in. It almost mocks a notion of security. And a similar thing happens when you walk in. There is no metal detectors in this place. There's hardly a formal sort of entrance, and it's certainly a way of entering this prison that is void of any of the symbolism, of the security rituals that take place surrounding any prison visits. You just walk in. We arrived at lunchtime, we were made a meal, and lunch is being had by prisoners and staff together. And what happened, as I find often happens during prison visits, you get talking. So we get talking to prisoners, and after a while, I sort of look up and I realize that we've been left alone, which means 2 visitors, my colleague from the University of Iceland and me, and a few prisoners, and everybody else had just left. And, you know, after lunch went back to do, you know, their education or their work or whatever it is that people were engaged with. And that struck me as really interesting, because a prison visit in the UK would be dominated by security considerations. A member of staff would not leave your side, and the whole experience would be very much couched in and dominated by security concerns. And there was an enormous absence of those things. So one thing about openness of an open prison seems to be an absence of the prison features that we all associated with the nature of prisons and imprisonment. And that gave me the idea to study these places more deeply. So what I ended up doing was spend a week in these 2 latter prisons as what I call a quasi-prisoner, which is a confusing and ambiguous role. But I asked the prison authorities and the prison governors, can you allow me for me to live the life of a prisoner and do what they do, and at least sample in some minor way the daily patterns and movements and experiences of prisoners. And they happily said yes. It didn't seem to be to them an outlandish or risky or controversial thing to ask. So it was organized relatively smoothly, even though you can imagine that university ethics took some time to negotiate. But also there was, I felt, quite a positive attitude to this plan. And while I was there, I spoke to everyone who was prepared to speak with me. I interviewed a good number of prisoners and staff. These were very semi-structured interviews where my opening question typically was, what's it like to be here, or what's it like to work here? And then the conversation flowed from there. And during these weeks, I had a host of observations, informal interactions, etc. So I wanted this to be explorative in the sense of there isn't really any scholarly literature on these places. I wanted it to be as immersive as I could make it, and I was very grateful for the chance of doing this, so that it isn't only that I was in the daytime, but I was there at night as well. I had breakfast in the prison. I socialized. I played games. I chatted. I had laughs, I have to say, with prisoners and with staff as well. I really wanted to try and give voice to prisoners in a way that went beyond the front end of the prison and also beyond initial impressions. And I was pleased I did, because one of the things I learned is that what prisons say to you in, say, the first 10 minutes of an interview may well be relatively different from what they say when they get to know you just that little bit better. So I did feel that this method gained me a level of insight that I wouldn't have had from more superficial, more fleeting ways of engaging with these places and the people in them. So I'll talk you through some photographs, just because pictures tell 1,000 words, and I'm hoping that it will warm you up for a discussion subsequently after Kristian's paper. So here again, you see the front of this prison. My room was one of those windows that you see. This is June, and there is still, as you can see, snowy mountaintops. Now, I don't want to be tasteless to show you a picture of the toilets, but with any sort of place, the state of the toilets can be so revealing as to the state of the place. overall. And the toilets in both these prisons were neat, tidy, cleaned extensively on a daily basis. And somehow, to me, that is revealing about an overall attitude towards order and towards cleanliness. Here's here's my room in one of the prisons. Apologies for the fizzy drink. I don't have any sponsorships from any fizzy drink manufacturer, but just to give you a flavor of what this looks like. And I've been told many times it looks a bit like student residences, and they really do in both occasions. Here's the second. Again, my laptop that I was allowed to keep. There is quite generous internet access for prisoners in both prisons, with obvious restrictions. I don't need to explain that, but there is internet in room, although there's a ban on social media and on, of course, a number of other things too. But that connection to the outside world is very, very important. Here's a part of the communal area of the second prison, Queerbrigge, near the big mountain. And I was struck by the normality and the non-prisony nature of these communal spaces. So you see a coffee machine, you may spot a loaf of bread to the right, and just above the loaf of bread to the right, there is a little box which has tea bags in it of, a number of varieties. And basically, if anyone, member of staff or a prisoner fancies a drink, or is a little bit peckish, they can pop into this kitchen area and help themselves. So food is really there in abundance, and it is very, very low threshold to get. And it also speaks to a very large degree of internal movement within the prison, which is also, I think, a signifier towards openness. So these places are not characterized by officers with dangling keys, with doors opening and shutting. Often these doors are, noisy metal. The soundscape is very different, but also that fear of movement is there. So prisons don't tend to have sort of no-go areas or areas that are mysterious or of limit. And I also felt that was mimicked in how staff think about these areas. So I asked about this to officers and said, so can anyone just night and day come and grab themselves a coffee? And they said, well, they're not really supposed to do it at night. So I said, okay, but what if someone can't sleep or whatever and wants to help themselves to some food? I said, well, yeah, we won't say no, but we don't really like it if they do. And that was a sort of an attitude that I found replicated in other areas of this place as well, that it isn't operated by very hard rules or complicated rules or nonsensical rules. It was very low on rules, which means that sometimes officers had to, or so it seemed, make it up as they went along. This is the same prison, slightly different area. The area that I just showed is behind that half white wall that you can see right behind me. That's me in the picture. Again, it's the normality, the non-prison nature of this place. The lunch area is to the left behind me there. You see little plants, plant pots. You see a piano. There's some games on top of that. There is stuff on the wall. All of this seems to speak to me towards normality rather than, say, security considerations. And just, you can only make out the edge of it. There's a very comfy sofa that I'm standing right in front of. So again, the notions of normality rather than safety or notions of risk that dominate how these places are being set up and what they look like. I'll give you this picture because open prisons in many Nordic countries, I suppose, and also maybe in many other places, there's an association with farming, with an outdoorsy lifestyle, and with a notion that healthy living is what many prisoners need. So there tends to be a philosophy that runs along the lines of prisoners leading chaotic lives often. And then when they are in an open prison, the idea is that they get introduced to or get used to a lifestyle that is organized around the good life, the simple life. And that means being outdoors, having meaningful occupations in the day, and then often it is things like livestock, like sheep on this occasion. The idea that caring for animals would be an intrinsic rehabilitative, an intrinsic self-improving type activity. And what I tended to find is that philosophy tends to dominate how both prisons work, which means that specialist care would be very hard to come by. Complex problems in, say, substance misuse or in mental health would not necessarily be recognized very quickly or addressed very quickly because of the assumption that order, a good meal, sensible work, the great outdoors, all those things should be enough to rehabilitate a prisoner, which is, I suppose, welcome in many ways, but also obviously clearly not enough for some prisoners. Show this very quickly. There is some stuff that I've submitted. If you Google my name, Francis Pakes, and you add Iceland, I've written a fair number of short, relatively experiential pieces if you were interested. Now, I want to say a few more things, but I know that time is short, so I don't want to dwell on this for too long, but be keen to discuss further if people were interested. The size of these places has clear implications, consequences for interpersonal relations. And at the same time, the fact that this is in Iceland with a certain culture, those two things together bring a way of liaising between prisoners and staff that I thought was quite extraordinary. And one of the things where I felt boundaries did not exist, where you would expect them to exist in a prison, is between what prisoners and staff know about each other in terms of their private lives, and how officers bring their private lives into the prison in a way that you would really not expect. So, for instance, when I was there was a prison officer who had been off sick for some time, and who just came back, he just popped in to say hello and remain connected to the job, I suppose. And it was clear immediately that most prisoners knew about this illness and knew what was the matter with the person. That was not seen to be, something like a violation of medical confidence or so. That was understood to be completely normal, that the prisoners also know what the matter was with this prisoner. There was an officer who brought their dog into the prison, which was appreciated, and the dog got a lot of fuss. There was even a officer who brought their child in on the odd occasion. It was a primary school-aged child. And even that did not seem to be seen as extraordinary. So I felt when it came to those kind of relationships and how overall staff liaise with prisoners, there was something about parenting that I felt was often the model, the analogy that staff use. So they talk about babysitting of a prisoner. I was explained about how staff would often discipline a prisoner if required in a way they would also discipline, say, a teenage child. They draw many parallels between being a parent and being a prison officer. Also interesting, and this may well be very specific to Iceland with its tiny prison estate, is that you don't have the separate prisons and separate arrangements for specific groups. So in these open prisons, they were mixed in terms of gender, sex offenders mixed with other offenders. There was quite an age range from 20s to 60s, and there is no way in which that leads to specialist provision. And of course, it leads to some issues, certainly at times, but they were almost always discussed as issues that they would somehow deal with in an informal type way. And of course, these things can get really complicated, and particularly in case where, as happened on one occasion, I was told a relationship was developing between a female prisoner and a male prisoner, which of course brought a whole host of issues for which there didn't seem to be much policy. So decision making had to occur. Again, as far as I was concerned, sort of by staff assuming the role of quasi-parents again, and seeking to safeguard the female prisoner, almost in a way. You might have discussions with a teenage daughter who has perhaps a new boyfriend. So there was something really amateurish about these places. Prison officers in Iceland get hardly any training. And because of that, tend to operate to a good degree on intuition, experience, and borrowing from other roles of responsibility in their lives, which very often was, as I said, parenthood. Looking a bit deeper, I came across a very interesting juxtaposition in terms of what prisoners and what staff value. And again, it's
sorry.
Sorry?
Just because we're already reaching the end of time for your slot, I was just wondering if we wanted to discuss this at the discussion.
Yeah.
I'll give you like 1 or 2 more minutes.
Okay, I'll round up on this slide, and then I'll stop. The juxtaposition is that what prisoners valued in these open prisons was the connection, the virtual connection to the outside, via mobile phone and internet. So prisoners could Skype their partner every day if they wanted to. So what prisoners told me as the best thing was that connection, that virtual connection via the screen, via phone to the outside. What staff told me was what they thought was essential was creating a atmosphere, a setting on the inside. So the food, the nature, the freedom of movement. So there was a strange juxtaposition that prisoners talked about openness as the ability to liaise with the outside world, whereas for staff, the notion of an open prison was to create an inside atmosphere. That was an interesting juxtaposition that I came across. But happy to discuss further, and I'll stop now and give Kristian the chance to speak.
Thank you, Francis. And yeah, we do have quite a bit of time to discuss further a bit later down the line. Kristian, do you want to share your slides?
Yes, 2 seconds. Can you see this all right now?
Yes.
Sorry. So yeah, okay, brilliant. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to this session. I'm very much looking forward to it and to the informal discussion after the presentation. So I will talk about open prisons from a comparative perspective. And so the exploration of low security imprisonment, the so-called open prisons, has, with a few notable exceptions, been pretty absent in the literature on prisons and their effects, as Anna also mentioned. And so while the skewed interest in high security prisons, the closed prisons, is understandable, given the dominance of this type of prison globally, it nonetheless reveals a missed opportunity to empirically explore the degree to which open and closed prisons share the basic similarities that, according to Gresham Sykes, are shared by all institutions we call prison. Indeed, one would expect that open prisons, with their minimum security arrangements and freer environment, would alleviate at least some of the pains resulting from the loss of liberty. However, as Victor Chamas has noted, based on a review of the sparse literature in this area, and I quote, "The fact is that we simply do not know whether open prisons work, that is, whether they rehabilitate more effectively and cause less damage," end quote. So I would like to address this shortcoming in this presentation, and I will do so by drawing on a paper that Anna and I, together with Julia Lausen and Simon Lamour, have written, where we compared the experiences of imprisonment between prisoners held in closed and open prisons in England and Wales and Norway, based on a survey with responses from 1,082 individuals held in 13 establishments. And the survey was designed to measure the subjective experience of imprisonment, including the most pressing pains and problems of being incarcerated. And the survey was conducted as part of the comparative penology project, where we interrogated the Nordic exceptionalism thesis. And we did so by comparing penal policies and prisoner experiences between a supposedly mild and inclusionary penal system, which was Norway in our study, and a supposedly hard and exclusionary penal system, which was England in our study. And we were 5 researchers on the project. So Anna and I, and Ben Crew, Julie Lausen, and Alice Evans. And we were conducting qualitative interviews and ethnographic fieldwork in a number of prisons in the 2 countries over the span of at least 3 years. And while my presentation today is informed by this qualitative fieldwork, I will mainly present findings from the survey we conducted. And I will try to explore 3 questions in this presentation. So first, what is the role and functions of open prisons in England and Wales and Norway? Secondly, what are the similarities and differences in subjective experiences of imprisonment between those held in open and closed prisons in the 2 jurisdictions? And thirdly, what are the pains of open confinement, and how do these pains compare to closed confinement? So the differences in the role and use of open prisons between England and Norway, as set out in this table, are stark. So as the figures show, Norway's open prison capacity is 32% compared to 6.5% in England. While no one is placed directly in open prisons in England and Wales, 2/3 of all entries in Norway are to open establishments. The prisoners who are directly placed in Norwegian open prisons are predominantly prisoners who have received shorter sentences, while only an estimated 5% of the total prison population spent at least some time in open prisons in England and Wales in 2019. 50% of the sentenced prison population in Norway did so. The advantages of being released from open prisons for resettlement reasons are stressed in policy documents in both countries. In England and Wales, a minority of releases, so around 6–7%, were from open prisons, whereas in Norway, this occurred to the majority of released prisoners, so 54%. And so the figures reported here not only show that Norway has more open facilities than England and Wales, but they also demonstrate the very different role and function these establishments have in the 2 prison systems. So while the resettlement function of open prisons is fairly similar in the 2 systems, though the eligibility criteria are stricter in England and Wales based on risk assessments, the key difference is that prisoners serving short sentences mainly do so in open prisons in Norway and in closed prisons in England and Wales. And as we will see shortly, this has significant implications for how prisoners experience their imprisonment, for the degree of harm inflicted on prisoners, and for how we should evaluate penal severity. So just a few pictures from me as well. Most of these pictures have been taken by Anna, who is she's a great photographer. I'm a lousy one, and I think you can see which one of the pictures that I took and not her. So this is one of our main field sites for the comparative penology project. It's Bjørgvin prison. It's a prison just outside Bergen, the 2nd largest city in Norway. So it's just a 20 minutes drive from the city center. And it's a prison predominantly for people on short sentences. So it used to be an institution for people with disabilities, but it was turned into a prison in 2006. And intriguingly, the main reason this prison was established was to deal with the prison queue. So we had a large number of people waiting to start serving their sentences, and to reduce that number of people waiting in line, they made this into an open prison. So it has often been referred to as a sentencing machine. It's a place where kind of a large number of people every year serve their sentences because their sentences are relatively short. This is the other kind of main research site of the open prisons in our study. It's called Berg Prison. It's located in the eastern part of Norway, and it's a typical kind of resettlement prison, a prison where people come towards the end of their sentences after having served in a closed prison state. And as you also mentioned, Francis, this is kind of farm-based prison. So quite a lot of people work on the farm, but it's also quite near a city. So people also go out to education and work in the nearby community. And this prison is also quite typical of kind of the history of open prisons, not only in Norway, but elsewhere as well. So it was an institution built by the Germans during the Second World War, and it was turned into a prison shortly afterwards to deal with the number of people sentenced to prison. And this is a picture from Spring Hill, the open prison we studied in England, which is a category D prison, and only has this resettlement function. So very, very rarely people would go directly to this prison. Okay, so having described the different use and function of open prisons in England and Wales and Norway, it remains to be explored how prisoners experience their imprisonment in open and closed prisons. And so based on the analysis of the conceptual parts of our survey, the table on the slide shows the mean dimension scores for open and closed prisons in both of these jurisdictions for 9 out of our 13 dimensions. And some of these dimensions are less intuitively understandable, and I will offer a brief description. So depth refers to the relationship between imprisonment and liberty, including sentence length, isolation within and beyond the prison, and levels of security and control. Weight is mainly related to interpersonal treatment, the use of staff power, and the quality of daily conditions. Tightness is linked to the softening of penal power and its manifestation in psychological rather than coercive forms. It relates to the use of risk assessments and cognitive behavioral interventions, incentive and early release schemes, and forms of monitoring. And breadth refers to the reach and impact of the sentence beyond the point of imprisonment. And so the data are coded so that a higher score is always better. So for example, a higher score for weight means a less oppressive environment. A score of 3 is regarded as neutral in the sense that it represents prisoners on average, neither agreeing nor disagreeing with the set of statements that make up each of these factors. And so these results prompt 3 main comments. Firstly, the main conclusion is that in both countries, all 9 dimension scores are higher and more positive for those in open compared to closed prisons. Prisoners held in open prisons experience their imprisonment as less heavy, deep, and tight. They enjoy more autonomy and trust. They express less worry about life post-release. They feel safer. They are slightly more positive about the help and services they receive. And finally, they experience their imprisonment as less punishing and degrading. Secondly, although the direction is uniform, the scores are significantly higher for those held in open conditions for only 5 dimensions in England. In Norway, the scores are significantly more positive for open prisons on all dimensions, apart from trust, which is interesting. In other words, and in evaluative terms, the contrast between closed and open confinement is more pronounced in Norway. And this contrast is mainly caused by the significantly more positive scores among those held in Norwegian open prisons compared to those held in open prison in England and Wales. In fact, the scores for those held in closed conditions in the two countries are remarkably similar. And lastly, the table also offers some indications on what it is that prisoners value the most about open prisons. In both countries, the dimensions with the highest scores among those held in open prisons are safety, depth, and punishment and degradation. So this means that these prisons are experienced as less restrictive, safer, and less harmful. It seems clear then that open prisons are capable of alleviating at least some of the pains of imprisonment. So, having established the main finding, prisoners held in open conditions rate their experiences more positively than those held in closed conditions in both countries. We now move on to a more detailed analysis of what kinds of pains and problems prisoners report in open and closed prisons. And so we do this by exploiting the problem and frustration part of our survey. And this part of the survey was designed to provide a measurement of what kinds of problems and frustrations prisoners find particularly painful, as well as how painful each of these problems are experienced. So in the two tables on this slide, we have listed the 10 highest scoring problem statements for those held in closed and open prisons in England and Wales and Norway. So the tables show what it is that prisoners held in closed and open prisons find particularly painful and frustrating. And the table contains a lot of text and very small, I think, and it is probably hard to make sense of all the details, but most importantly, the problem statements which feature in both closed and open prisons are shaded in the tables. And so with remarkable consistency, actually, the tables show that the most severe problems of imprisonment are almost identical in closed and open prisons. So contrary to some earlier qualitative studies, which have documented a set of specific pains experienced by prisoners in open prisons, our results suggest that the most pressing pains of imprisonment are similar in both closed and open prisons. However, the fact that the most prominent problems are the same masks considerable differences in absolute severity scores between those held in closed and open prisons. So on this slide, we show these differences where 45 problem statements are organized into 9 thematic dimensions. And the higher the score, the more painful is the problem perceived to be. So that's the logic for this table. And the blue line represents scores for closed prisons in England, the orange for closed prisons in Norway, the gray for open prisons in England, and the yellow for open prisons in Norway. And the figure shows that the lines very much follow the same pattern, further strengthening our finding that prisoners experience the same kinds of problems and frustrations in both closed and open prisons and across the two countries in our sample. Problems related to deprivation and outside relationships are rated as significantly more severe than problems related to mental and physical well-being and social frustration. And the figure suggests that the pains of imprisonment have a certain generic pattern, largely unaffected by national context and type of prison. Importantly, however, the figure also demonstrates that the absolute severity scores for each of the dimensions are higher for those held in closed conditions. So while imprisonment seems to produce similar kinds of problems and frustrations, they are perceived as less severe and more manageable among those in open prisons. So to what degree do closed and open prisons share the basic similarities that Sykes alluded to? The findings presented in our study both support and challenge Sykes' original claim. Our findings support the claim because they demonstrate that prisoners experience the same kinds of problems in both prison categories. Furthermore, prisoners in England and Wales and Norway are remarkably consistent when they rate what it is they find particularly painful about imprisonment. The deprivation of liberty and the loss of contact with family and friends is what hurts the most in both types of prisons and in both countries. And this finding is slightly at odds with the qualitative research on open prisons, highlighting that open prisons produce a distinct set of pains related to ambiguity, boundary blurring, ambivalence, and self-regulation. There is little in our survey data that supports the idea that open prisons produce a distinct set of pains. The findings presented here also challenge Sykes' claim. Our results show that open prisons are, on average, experienced as safer, less restrictive, and less degrading institutions than closed prisons. And furthermore, while it is true that prisoners experience the same kinds of problems in both types of prisons, those problems are, on average, experienced as significantly less severe and acute in the open prisons. Finally, I believe our findings and our study raise some important policy implications that I would like to raise, and perhaps we can come back to them in the discussion. For those who are sympathetic to the normality principle, stating that the deprivation of liberty should be the only punishment inflicted on offenders while other rights remain intact, open prisons seem to have many advantages. Most notably, they seem to produce less pain. For those concerned with costs and resources, open prisons are considerably cheaper to fund. A placement in open prisons costs 37% less than a placement in closed prisons in Norway. For those concerned with rehabilitation and resettlement, open prisons seem to be safer, more decent, and less degrading institutions, which is, I would argue, both a good in its own right and may make other positive outcomes more achievable. Finally, for those worrying that open prisons are or will be considered by the public to be too soft or lenient, our study documents that despite the greater freedoms they offer, open prisons are still very much experienced as prisons. Prisoners held there experience the same kinds of problems and frustrations as in closed prisons. The main difference is that these pains are experienced as less acute. And the first open prisons developed in countries such as the US and England and Wales, jurisdictions which are now characterized as neoliberal and exclusionary in their approach to punishment and are struggling with overcrowding. One of the initial purposes and functions of open establishments was to deal with the increased demand to incarcerate a high number of low-risk prisoners after the Second World War. So it remains to be seen, I think, whether the open prison can serve a similar function in the current era of overcrowding and mass incarceration. Thank you.
Thanks so much, both Kristian and Francis, for your presentations. They were both really interesting and insightful. As we're already quite far along time-wise, I would suggest that I cut short the part where I ask you a few questions and limit that to maybe 2 or 3, and then we open up discussion more generally. I have a little addition on my arm. I hope she'll stay asleep, hopefully. Okay. I think you're both right about open prisons mostly being in attractive settings and possessing a kind of distinct atmosphere that is very different from the closed estate. And we were just wondering in what ways might it be possible to have open prisons placed in other settings? So, for example, in very urban areas, in conurbations, or just in different settings to what we've seen so far, where all the prisons I think that we spoke about were relatively rural. Even the one in Bergen, Onje Bergen, that is obviously not too far from quite a big city, but still, you know, very much placed in the countryside. So we were just wondering, is it a possibility that could be extended to city centers in big cities?
Do you want to go first,
you go
Kristian?
first. No, please,
Okay,
please.
Thanks, Anna. It's a really interesting question. I agree that what you tend to see, and also what you tend to associate, is open prisons with fresh air. Thinking about the UK and the location of open prisons, I'm thinking of, for instance, Ford Open Prison, which is on the south coast. And I'm also thinking about North Sea Camp, which is on the North Sea coast. So maybe there's also something about coastal locations and open prisons, but I can't say that I have any sort of systematic knowledge on that. What I found characteristic of the open prisons in Iceland is that they were more characterized by the outside world coming in virtually, rather than that prisoners physically leave the premises all the time. They didn't really go out for work or for education or so. And if that was the situation, then I suppose they could be in lots of different places, because one of the pressure points might be how local communities react to a prison of which prisoners leave the establishment all the time. I could imagine specific sensitivities around that. So I don't think that per definition they would need to be in remote or rural areas, but it does seem to be where they have ended up quite often.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so I think so we definitely do have open prisons in Norway, which is in kind of urban areas. So for instance, the one unit in Arendal prison where we did our research was in more or less in the city center, like an open prison in the city center, just next to the closed prison, which was built in the 1860s, you know, and the city just grew around the prison. And you know, it's possible, but it's a bit demanding. So for like from a prisoner perspective, it's quite demanding when your friends walk past the prison on their way home back from the pub late at night, you know, possibly shouting, you know, over to their friend in prison, in the open prison, where you know, when you know you can just leave, you know, there is no perimeter fence, there is no, so it's a kind of, it demands a lot of prisoners, I think, if you have that kind of presence to your ordinary life and your family and friends on the outside. So from a prisoner perspective, I don't think kind of, you know, it makes sense that they are at least, that they are not located in the, like the hub of the city. But that said, I think also the trend in Norwegian policy discussions has been that those open prisons that are really remote, as kind of as it appears that the open prisons you talked about in Iceland was, Francis, that is perhaps not the best idea either, because you know quite a few of the people in open prisons, they go to education in the community, they attend work in the community, and it's an ideal that quite a lot of people will do that because it's supposed to ease the transition back into the community after having served a sentence. And if you're like really remote, as in the island we visited, Anna, just outside of Bergen, it's really, really hard to do that. So kind of, I don't know, you write about that in your article, Francis, that kind of the Icelandic prisons are more like sanctuaries. They are not a springboard back into ordinary life, so to speak. But I think some of the Norwegian open prisons can be kind of quite effective springboards back into the ordinary life in the community after release, because they live quite close to places where they can go to work and join education and so on. Yeah. And also, I think it's a pragmatic thing, you know, having prisons, like even the closed prisons, they are not built in city centers, at least not in my country anymore. They also are now more to a stronger extent being built in kind of more rural areas, because just it's so much more expensive to build a prison or to have a prison in a city center because of property prices, for instance. So I think definitely it's a pragmatic thing as well.
Thank you. I think it's just really interesting to talk about the kind of distinctions between open prisons in different locations. And as Francis already said as well, that scale matters. So I guess we can see kind of differences in location in terms of urban and rural, but also in terms of just general size and so on, which we hopefully be able to talk a little bit more about in a minute. But I just wanted to mention in terms of the discussion around urban and rural places, how there's a very interesting example in Scotland right now where they're trialing a kind of a semi-open community centre style prison for women in the centre of Glasgow, which is just opened last year, I believe. So there will be kind of other places that we might be able to consider, and that where we don't know any research being done there yet, but or we don't know outcomes. But yeah, Kristian.
Yeah, just very quickly. So I forgot to say. So the term open prison kind of doesn't exist formally in Norwegian policy documents. So it's called low. So the formal term is low security prison. And in that kind of low security prison category, you will have what we refer to as open prisons, but you will also have kind of what we call overgangsbolig, which is a halfway house. I think it directly translates to transitional housing. So it's formally low security imprisonment, but those kind of those halfway houses, transitional houses, they are almost always in city centers. Like it seems a bit like what you describe based on the Scottish example, Anna. So these are really small kind of penal institutions. They don't look like a prison at all, no fences at all. It looks like ordinary houses and apartments. But the kind of the eligibility criteria to serve in a halfway house when you are approaching release is that you have to have work or education during the daytime. So it's not a place where you kind of spend your days. It's a place where you sleep, but then you go off work. So I forgot to say, but I think Christophe wants to say something.
Yes, what you said about the problem of open prisons in the city, being the fact that you are close to the normal society or the free society, and it's quite it's a pain in itself to know that something is so close to you but you can't access it. Reminds me a study made in Belgium about the pains of electronic monitoring. And one of the pains of electronic monitoring was the fact that they were immersed in a normal society, but not able to act as normal people. So, for instance, they had many occasions of meeting friends or colleagues, or going to the school to get their children and so on. But every time there was some kind of limit between them and the other ones, just because they couldn't accept going for a drink or just going to a shop to buy some things because they have a quarter to get back to home. And it's no question to say, oh yeah, I have to go to the supermarket because, and so on. So this, maybe this is the other side of the openness that's here. It's the fact that it's open, but it's never open enough. And this is maybe also a definition of the problematic of the imprisonment or the carceral, maybe, that could spread to electronic monitoring. So I think that a comparison would be interesting between a closed, open, and electronic monitoring. And also another reflection, I think that we see here two kinds of openness. There is the openness as access to the services, the jobs, the educations, and so on, and the openness of the walls of nature and so on, but where distance is a form of closure. But it shows also that open prison doesn't exist not only for technical reasons, but also because there are different ways of thinking about what open means. So yeah, it's a really equivocal term in the end. Yes, just.
Thanks, Christophe. I think it's a good point to just add one more question before we open the discussion up to everyone, which would be that to what extent open prisons kind of question the limits of the concept of prison itself, as Christophe has already kind of delved into a little bit. And I think it fits in very well with the overall theme of the conference itself, which looked at a lot of different abolitionist ideas and agendas. And to maybe ask a little bit more about how open or where open prisons sit in this kind of continuum of penalty, maybe, and if they provide a kind of different, a kind of reformist or different way of looking at imprisonment that is less painful and so on, or if that is even an option in terms of kind of abolitionist thinking, and where that would take us in terms of the kind of ability to criticize the carceral system if we create a system that is more open, that is less painful, and so on. I don't know if you want to just briefly both reflect on this before we move on to open up the questions to everyone. Thank you.
Shall I go first again, Kristian, if that's okay? It's a really interesting question, and there is something about how open prisons challenge not only our scholarly perceptions and understandings of confinement and imprisonment, but also to the prisoners themselves. I found on the odd occasion that prisoners found it difficult to apply the label prison to these open prisons. So in conversation, it sometimes happens that they said, well, you know, if you mess up here, you go back to prison, as if their current open location isn't quite deserving of that term prison, which they then reserve for the closed prisons. I'd like to think, and I've tried to explain this on occasion, but it's really difficult, I find, to find the right words, because sometimes I feel like we are stifled in our thinking about prison because there is a rigidity about that term. And I was really encouraged. I was in Edinburgh not long ago, and there was lots of talk about the Bella unit, I think one is called, in the really small new settings for women's prisons. You know, it spoke to a degree of creativity in how we can do imprisonment differently from, you know, the Victorian prison notion that is so pervasive in the UK. So it does stretch, I think, our understandings, those on the inside and those on the outside. If you link it to abolition, that's more of a stretch. And I think both Kristian's research and mine shows that it's still experienced as imprisonment, being in an open prison, even though the setting itself, the physical setting itself, isn't always suited to be called a prison, but it's still imprisonment, what people experience, I think. I don't think, like Kristian says, the pains may be lessened, but they are still there.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, really good question, Anna, and tricky. So I think what you say about kind of the carceral continuum definitely makes sense. And I think based on your presentation and your publications, Francis, I think the Norwegian open prisons that we have been, and certainly the open prison in England, is more of a prison than the open prisons in Iceland. So I think most of our interviewees would definitely think of these institutions as prisons. So I think that the idea for carceral continuum makes sense. but in terms of the abolitionists, so whether or not arguing in favor of open prison is in some sense detrimental or dangerous because it kind of takes some of the potency of the criticism against prisons away. So I don't think, so I'm not so, that's not my main concern. So I think we now know that having more people in prisons that are more open, we now know that, you know, that's a way to reduce harm and reduce pain. And I think, I think I'm pragmatic. I think that's a good thing. And Nils Christie wrote in Limits to Pain that, you know, one rule is to, you know, do not inflict pain, and another rule is to inflict pain as little as possible. And I think there are, you know, open prisons are one way that we can reduce the kind of the harm and the pain that the criminal justice system inflicts on people. And I think, so like speaking from our project, in Norway, 50%, so half of the prisoner population spends at least some time in open prisons. And the equivalent in England is 5 or 6%. And when we know that the open prisons are safer, less degrading, they are less costly, very few people escape, very few absconds. We also know that people who are released from open prisons, they have lower reconviction rates. That might, of course, be some selection bias, so that the people who are allowed to go to open prisons may be less prone to convict new crimes after they release. But I think there are so many. We have so much evidence that it's also safe from a kind of crime prevention perspective to have people in open prisons. So I think that's my stance on the abolitionist question, at least. But it will be interesting to discuss that further.
Thank you so much. I think it would be great to just open the discussion up, and I would encourage everyone who's currently has their camera turned off to maybe turn it on, just so we feel like we can see each other. Just if you want to, that'd be wonderful. And it's great to see you all, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more people joining us later with the recording as well. And I just wanted to maybe start off. And Christophe and I will probably share this part of the conversation in terms of chairing it, just so you know that. I just wanted to kind of start off with a question from Daria, unless you want to ask it yourself again, Daria.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Hi everyone, by the way. Okay, let me just find it. So I think this is to both Francis and Kristian, because I'd be curious to hear both of your reflections on this. And I don't know if I phrased it right, but hopefully it makes some sort of sense. So I'd be curious to know if you think that both the material conditions and the sort of relational environment in open prisons that's slightly better compared to closed prisons communicate something to the people imprisoned about their moral worth, something that different perhaps to closed prisons, if that makes sense.
Really good, really interesting question. If it's okay, for me to start. I think there is something about that. There is something about the interactivity, the material conditions, but also the relationships that I do think, and I'm not even sure that officers know they're doing that explicitly. But the fact that they often, in Iceland at least, where due a lack of training, I think to a large degree, and a lack of policy, adopt pseudo parenting models in their engagement with prisoners, that it is individualized, they know their prisoners, and I do think that does communicate something about value or about seeing you as an individual. I do think that occurs, and I was just thinking, and what I tend to do, so apologies, is I get lost in anecdote, but just a story that I think signals this is that at one point in one of the open prisons, a relatively young prisoner was clearly upset and stormed out of the house, out of the prison. And I saw that happen, and I thought, as a researcher, what do I do? You know, you're not meant to intervene too much, but at the same time, I was thinking, should I tell someone? Should I go up? But before I could do anything, one of the officers went after him very quickly and seemingly very effectively calmed him down and eased the situation. And it reminded me of what in the work of Ben Crew and others is called light present. That you want a prison that doesn't feel oppressive. But at the same time, you don't want a prison that is lax, because it could descend into chaos. And I thought at that moment in time, that was exactly the light presence that I think prisoners often would value. That they don't sit on top of you, but if something happens, they are there. And that I thought were the moments where I thought, even though they do it without being trained, in that moment, I thought they got that exactly right, to be there in a light presence sort of way. And I do think it has a moral undertone. Yes, I do think that there is something about seeing them and knowing them as individuals. Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Daria, and I completely agree with Francis. I think it communicates a different moral worth to prisoners when they are kept in institutions where they have more autonomy, where they have more freedom of movement, and where they are trusted more. I definitely think so, and I think, you know, it's and I think it's in our kind of qualitative material. I think it's there without people being very explicit about it. I think it's in their descriptions of their life. I think it shows in general that that people can retain a more sense of moral worth. And I came across Tapio Lappi-Seppälä, the Finnish prison researcher. He just wrote a chapter where he also wrote about the open prisons, and I think he has a brilliant quote, and I would like to read it, because he describes the use of open prisons in the Nordic countries and kind of goes through the arguments in favor of open prisons. Less costly. They seems to have lower recidivism rates when people are released from open prisons and so on. But then it says, but what matters most is to what extent enforcement practices meet the demands of decent and legitimate use of criminal law. In this respect, open enforcement, which express trust and confidence in the prisoner's own sense of responsibility, reflects a more civilized and enlightened view of offenders as individuals capable of reform and capable of taking responsibility of their actions. And I think that's a really good. I think that's a really good point. So you know, there are lots of positive things to say about open prisons, but this is perhaps the most important one. But just one intriguing thing. So in the survey, when we only looked at the Norwegian results, kind of the dimension we thought would kind of be significantly more positive in open prisons compared to closed was trust. But it was the dimension which was negatively scored. So it was a negative score in the open prisons. And it was hardly significant at all, like differences between closed and open prisons. And we have discussed that, Anna and I, and with our colleagues quite a lot, like how can we explain that a prison which like communicates so clearly that we trust you to, you know, walk around and to have, you know, to be able to leave the prison basically whenever you want to, because the perimeter fence is either absent or really easy to climb over and so on. but I think kind of and one of the anonymous reviewers of for this paper suggested this interpretation, and I think it's quite valid. So quite a lot of the Norwegian open prisons, they don't have, so there are not that many staff present in a prison, and they are present to a very different degree than in closed prisons. So prison officers in Norwegian closed prisons, they are really, they see prisoners much more on a day-to-day basis. So in the open prisons, it's a bit less affair. Like if people are moving around, and if they need officers, if they need staff for any sort of emotional or practical issues, they have to kind of see them. It's not like the officers are around all the time. And so it might be that kind of the low scores for trust in our survey kind of reflects the fact that officers are not that present in a way that kind of, yeah, but it still doesn't quite make sense. We're not completely sure how to interpret the kind of the low trust scores for open prisons.
I think in
Can I ask
the
a bit
text
to
of yeah, go on, Francis. I wanted to make a reference to your text, so maybe you have the same reflection as I.
I just thought it was so interesting what you said about, it's a nebulous notion, trust. And Iceland's open prison, you would also characterize as high trust environments if you take the prison as your frame of reference. And there is something about staff availability. And the two prisons that I was in Iceland were actually very different about that very characteristic, where in the one prison, staff were present, but sometimes to the extent that prisoners wanted to ridicule it. So for instance, there was a member of staff who wanted to organize like games and stuff. And many prisoners thought, I'm not going to sit and play a game with an officer, board games, etc. So they felt that presence sometimes was a bit too much. In the other, staff kept to themselves a bit more in staff quarters. And that door was then closed. So the prisoners often joked that in that prison, we're not behind bars, they are. So only the chickens and the officers are behind bars and not us. So the notion of presence and how that presence is sensed and evaluated by prisoners is possibly quite a telling thing. So it is about staff numbers, but also about the physical availability of staff and how prisoners judge the motives of that presence.
I wonder also, Francis, I think that in your text you mentioned the fact that some prisoners say that they feel a hypocrisy of the system. They are sympathetic with us, but it's not a real relationship that can be really trusted. And I wonder also if the absence of trust is not because this population is well aware of what can hide behind prison, yes, but also care and also other ways for the states to get them back in the row. And so I don't know if they are not constantly aware of the fact that they really sit in prison for some reasons, and even if it's a mild prison, it remains something like a coercion and so on. Maybe this is also, but I don't know, it's a hypothesis. What do you think about it, Francis?
It's really interesting, and it makes me think again about how stuff was presented to me and how I then try to make sense of that subsequently. On the one hand, and it depends on the prisoner too. So I had a really interesting mix of some heavy dudes, let's put it that way, people on drug trafficking charges who were there for a decade or more and who were then in the open prison near the end, as well as prisoners who spent only a few weeks in the closed estate. It was they were no trouble at all, and they ended up for, say, a non-violent offense or so. So I would say individuals really without either a criminal or a prisoner identity who were sharing the space with these guys who had been in prison abroad and who now were here. And the more experienced prisoners, if I can use that term, had a certain disdain for these officers who were just amateurs trying to be friendly to everyone, and didn't really respect them deeply. And that ambiguity that I think you were talking about was very much felt by them, that they thought these guys can't really keep order if they had to, but if they open their mouths and say something, I go back to closed. So they had this, there was an ambiguity and a strange texture about how power works in these places where the power is there, but it's not really visible, it's not really exercised in any sort of consistent way. But of course, the bottom end is that they remain coercive environments, even though you can kid yourself on a daily basis that that's hardly the case. But of course, ultimately, they still are. Yeah,
no, I think that's valid points. So I think the kind of the lack of trust can be, it could be interactional. So it can be because prisoners don't interact as much, and you need interaction to trust people. You need to engage with people for trust to develop. So that's one interpretation, and the other one is it's also kind of the thing that's been raised in kind of Victor Sharma's work and other people's more qualitative work on open prisons, that kind of, so it's definitely, you have more autonomy than in closed prisons, but but you don't have all the autonomy you would like. It's more open, but it's not as open as you would like it to be. You have you are trusted more, but you are not trusted as much as you would like to be trusted. So I think that might be a dynamic as well. And I completely agree with you, Francis, that kind of the basic premise of the open prison, you can't understand the open prison without seeing it in relation to the closed prison, because that if you misbehave, if you show yourself not to be worthy of the trust that you have been provided by the prison service, you go back to closed prison. So kind of that threat or that fear of being sent back if you do something wrong is always, is always there. And so it's not an institution where I think where trust comes easy because of these kind of because of these institutional elements.
Last thing I'll say about this, because I'd like to move on to Claire as well, if we could, is and prisoners know it happens. So even in these very small places, people will all have a recollection of someone who used drugs or did whatever and got sent back. So to be sent back to closed is real as a thing that can happen. And like you say for Norwegian data as well, Kristian, for prisoners, the difference between a closed prison in Iceland and the open prison is stark. Mm-hmm. So they really do not want to get sent back. So that is definitely a worry, a fear, a niggle that exists. They don't talk about it much, but it's definitely there. So I agree with you there completely.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience? We still got some, but yeah, Claire, do you want to comment? Yeah, please do.
Thank you. Yeah, just I think kind of following on from that, it was kind of more of a comment initially around, as I said, I'm working at the moment in women's prisons in England. And I was sort of struck by a comment that a woman made to me a little while ago about she actually preferred, she's on a very long sentence, but she said she actually preferred the closed conditions because of what she described as a sort of an unreal or a sort of a false freedom of being in open conditions. And I think it sort of relates to what you were saying about that sort of ever-present, maybe covert boundaries that are there, that as you say, if you mess up, you go back to closed, or it's kind of possibly relating to that trust element, that you may be in a much nicer setting. Certainly this particular prison that I'm thinking of is absolutely gorgeous, and it's a former manor house, so it's in a beautiful setting. Again, working farm. Interesting thing as well about open prisons. But again, there's that thing around distance, and I think, again, especially with the women's prisons, there are only 2 women's prisons in the country, so women sent to prison in England are likely to be going quite a distance anyway, but going to open prisons is likely to be even more of a distance from home. And just linking back to Kristian, something in, if I've read it right, that both in England and Norway, the thought of disappointing family was more present for prisoners in open conditions than in closed in both, I think. So I was just wondering if there's possibly something about that physical distance, but also that kind of, as you're approaching the end of your sentence, thinking much more about integration and how that sort of juxtaposition works.
Oh, thank you. But just to clarify, so the last point you made was that we found that kind of worrying about people on the outside was more prominent in the open prisons than in the closed prisons.
I think so. Is it? Because I think they were ranked, weren't they? I think in order of level of concern. I could be reading it wrong. Sorry, I have been trying to with the Australian session, so I don't know what time it is currently.
No. I will have to have a proper look at it, but I don't think so. So I think for all kind of the problem statements, people would for instance worry more about relationships outside amongst those held in closed prisons than in open prisons. But I will definitely double check. But regards to the kind of the first point, the woman you interviewed who preferred staying in a closed prison to an open prison, I think that's really, really interesting. And we heard quite a lot of that in our fieldwork ourselves. And I think that there are many ways to kind of make sense of that. I think for some people, it depends on what you want from your sentence. So some of the men, for instance, we interviewed who preferred to be in a closed prison to an open prison, they didn't want necessarily so much from the sentence, like they weren't on their road to get an education or vocational certificates, or like they wanted time to move as fast as possible to just be out again. And some of them preferred the closed prison because they felt time went quicker, for instance, and so on. But the other thing I wanted to say is that it's a bit tricky to talk about the open prison as we do today, because I think there are so much variety among open prisons. I think just based on the description from Iceland to Norway, and I think about the Norwegian open prisons we've been to, they are so different. So one of the open prisons we went to was a kind of we just call it the lumberjack prison. I had to drive 3 hours in the middle of nowhere. Like, it was a prison where people stayed in small cabins and they were chopping wood all day. There was nothing else to do but chopping wood, but then you also have another unit in the very same prison in the city center, an open prison in the city center where you can be at the pub 5 minutes down the street. So they are extremely not extremely, but they are very different. And correct me if you disagree, Anna, but the open prison we went to in England, the scores for tightness was also much higher in that prison compared to the Norwegian open prisons. And what people also described there was a kind of walking on eggshells situation where you were constantly worried that you might be sent back to the closed estate for kind of minor, subtle infringements or rule violations. So there was this sense of feeling that you didn't know kind of exactly where the boundary is, how to behave in a prison like that. But I think in the better open prisons we visited, you know, people were a bit more relaxed about that. They knew that staff wasn't trying to look out for mistakes, or like they wanted you to complete your sentence in a decent way. So I think I think that the relational dynamics also is really, they differ a lot between the open prisons.
Thank you. It's nearly the end of this session. Maybe I think that a question that comes and comes again is the question of the definition of the nature of open prisons. So maybe I could ask a last thought from our presenters about the fact that should open prison be defined by its regime, buildings, and so on, or by the feelings and the perception of the inmates? Because it seems there's not always a match between the two of them. So what's your reflection about this? Is openness a question of organization and buildings, or question of perception and experience of prison? I know it's tricky.
It's such a hard one to finish on and be succinct about, Christophe. There is something about permeability, the outside world coming in, and the outside world somehow being available to those on the inside. That's really key. And what that tends to come with is, at least in theory or on many occasions, a slightly more relaxed, a slightly more, let's say, authentic way of prisoners liaising with each other and liaising with staff. But is that permeability, because prisons really are about isolation and deprivation. And then open prisons are a way, are not a different thing, but a lighter version of those things. So they are relatively different, but they are not categorically different, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. I agree with Francis. It's a difficult question to end, but so based on the kind of the Norwegian system, I think I would say that it is about buildings. It is about institutions. Because formally, kind of, as I said, we don't have an open prison. It doesn't exist formally. We have prisons with lower security, but we also call serving a sentence with electronic monitoring, we call that imprisonment. And we also called serving the last part of your sentence in a transitional housing, halfway house, we call that imprisonment. But those are not open prisons. So I think I would, to my mind at least, it makes sense to talk about open prisons as some institutions with some characteristics, but to nail down what those characteristics are is tricky.
In a way, it's a good news. We got work to go, so it's like always with prison. It's a never-ending story. So I can only thank the audience and the presenters. Thank you very much. Thank you also for the youngest carceral geographer in the world, who was really calm during this session. And yeah, that's maybe genetics, good parents, and yeah, that's it. But I want to thank you all. This is the end of the conference. We were the last in line, online. Yes, thank you all, and have a nice day. If it's possible in your area, have a good night if you are in Australia.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Bye.
So that session marks the end of the 5th International Conference for Carceral Geography 2022, held and hosted by the University of Melbourne, Australia. What an absolutely wonderful conference, diverse speakers covering a range of topics, a range of empirical methods and ontological approaches. And I think that vibrancy was really wonderful, and I hope that you felt it wherever you were tuning in from in the world. We had five keynote presentations, 28 parallel sessions, the exploration seminar that just preceded me talking, a fantastic early career workshop, 2 film screenings and an art program of beautiful and powerful installations. The hybrid approach means that hopefully there's been more opportunity to engage than we've ever had before in terms of these international conferences for carceral geography. If you missed anything or you weren't able to attend it in person, then I'll hopefully be getting the recordings up on the Carceral Geography website in the new year. This will also include trying to capture some of the art program as well. So do keep your eyes on your inbox in the new year, and we'll notify you when it's ready. This has been a special conference and an ambitious one. You know, as a geography working group, we're also really, of course, aware of the significance of space and have been very lucky to have had that space to think, and to think in particular ways via the conference being hosted in Australia, acknowledging its colonial history and the particular landscapes and politics of incarceration there. Hopefully the range of papers and plenaries that we've heard illuminates both discourse, both within and outside of the Australian context. It's been a really eye-opening and really powerful, and I think a passionate conference this year. And so I'd like to send my heartfelt thanks as chair of the Carceral Geography Working Group. This includes thanks to all of our fantastic presenters and all of the delegates who've made efforts to travel to Australia, and everyone who's tuned in, perhaps at very sort of ungodly times. Please, if you will, indulge me while I say thanks and to name a few particular people. First and foremost, of course, our conference chair, Claire Loughton. Thank you so much for all of your efforts in making this conference a success. I hope everyone shares my sincere thanks to you in doing that. Of course, supported by a wider team, Diana Johns, Bree Carlton, Michelle McDonnell, Eladia Wilson. Thank you to all of you there. Thanks to the particular sessions organisers who took special efforts to convene themed panel sessions, with mention in particular to the team at Inside Wire, Colorado Prison Radio, who formed a feat of engineering and barrier breaking in zooming in their incarcerated colleagues to our conference. Fantastic effort there. Thanks to anyone who chaired a session and the fantastic team of student assistants and conference volunteers who made this happen on the ground, so to speak, in Melbourne. My heartfelt thanks to Tyne and Michael Crooks, who provided the technical infrastructure and the support for that infrastructure to help make this online and parallel hybrid sessions possible. This conference was also, and I think it's important to note, a culmination of highly engaged and ambitious activities by the Carceral Geography Working Group over the last 2 years. So I would like, if I can, to mention the multitude of other activities and events that have allowed the Carceral Geography Working Group to build the traction necessary to make this international conference so successful. So I personally thank the Carceral Geography Working Group Committee and the Advisory Board who've been involved in 2 years worth of pre-conference events and activities. So that includes our regular stalwarts, Claire Loughton and Schliehe, and Dina Varner, who've been working on book reviews, Lauren Martin and Lara Palumbo with our prizes to engage excellent early career scholars. We've had events such as the Critical Geographies of Confinement, organised by Deirdre Conlon, Sasha Brown, Joseph Robinson. Our Explorations and Carceral Geography Seminar Series coordinators, Anna Schliehe, Christophe, Franck, Ollivon and Olivier Mjåland. Finally, to our early career researcher perspectives and carceral geography team, Hannah Stevens, Ella By the Way Jackson, James Gasek, Dominique Moran, and in particular, Eleanor March, who's been absolutely fantastic in leading the showcasing of our early career scholars. This is something that I'm really proud of. Claire took on this mammoth task of organising a conference at the end of these 2 years event with absolute gusto when we asked her to chair this conference after the previous one. Her efforts are heroic, to say the least, and this conference then marks the end of a prosperous 2 years of carceral geography and the growth of the network into a collection of more than 200 persons across 29 countries. And there are many more thanks that I could offer here. Yeah, of course, I do have the opportunity to help us expand this network. Please do join if you're interested in participating. Membership's free, and we encourage all voices across all disciplines to help us to continue our work in advancing the broad view of carceral geography and to foster greater communication among scholars in this field and beyond. So on my part, all that remains to say is that we can look forward to our next international conference for carceral geography to be held in 2024. Location is pending. I'm sure you'll be excited to hear of this in due course. However, please do engage if you can with our next and upcoming events, which will take place in spring 2023. So we hope to see many of you again as part of our carceral geography working group activities, where you will be most and warmly welcomed. Thank you, everyone.